Hello, everyone, and welcome to this open lecture from the EUniWell Open Lecture Series. It's a great pleasure today to welcome you here for this lecture of our colleague, Dr. Jenny Allsopp. Jenny has been working for many years on the issues of youth migration, well-being, and social policy. Our lecture today focuses in particular on the role and the power of storytelling in the pursuit of well-being. Jenny has joined Birmingham last year. Previously, she was at Harvard University as a postdoctoral fellow. Before that, she was working at SOAS. And as part of this work, she has had the opportunity to travel all around the globe to develop a series of conversation around migration and with the participatory angle. Her two books in which she has been co-authoring are Policing Humanitarianism, EU anti-smuggling policies and their impact on civil society, and more recently with Elaine Chase, Youth Migration and the Politics of Well-being. Jenny, the floor is yours. We have about 45 to 50 minutes for the lecture, and then we'll leave some time for the question and answer in the end. There is a box on your screen for question and answer, so feel free to post them there, and then I will try to summarize them at the end for Jenny to answer.
Great, thank you, Nando. And I should just say that none of this work would be possible without Nando, because he has been an unbelievable mentor, colleague and friend for I think well over a decade now. So it's really special to be introduced by you, Nando, and thank you very much. I'm going to start quite unusually with a rap. Why am underrate the black? They try to stop me, but they can't stop me now. Because God always bless me now. No matter what, we are rising. We're going to rise out of the ghetto, the vampire hot like fire, but I'm burning higher. It's not my rap, you probably won't be surprised to hear. It's a rap that Yusuf, a 16-year-old Ghanaian, began to recite to me in a Roman pizzeria after I asked him to tell me about his life as a migrant in Italy. My research involved narrative interviews, which were framed by some questions, but the young people I spoke to would commonly take charge and tell me the stories they wanted to hear. They wanted me to hear, and they do so on their own terms too. Yusuf told me, in no uncertain terms, that his migration was the Black Odyssey. His comment made me nostalgic for my own undergraduate degree in literature, and it prompted me to pull out my old books. I spent the next few months of my time in Rome doing fieldwork in a refugee camp while rereading Dante's 14th century masterwork, The Divine Comedy. As those of you who know me will inevitably know, this is my favorite book. In fact, I'm obsessed with it, and I even have a cat that I have named Dante Alighi Hairy, which I find highly amusing. In The Divine Comedy, Dante, the author and character, passes through the underworld, meeting people who are real and imagined, who've been placed in hell, purgatory, and heaven by the hand of divine providence. As he travels, he hears their stories, and he's deeply moved and distressed by what he hears. Particularly in hell, he's disturbed by how people have become stuck, condemned to live in the present tense, in the act of their sin forever. Inferno is, I always say, a kind of fictional ethnography of the afterlife, because it feels so real and it moves me deeply. The quote that I've used to name this lecture therefore comes from the start of the book. In the middle of the journey of my life, I found myself in a dark wood because the straight path was lost. I fitted in my reading of Dante in the camp alongside the usual routine, dressing wounds from dog bites inflicted by Europe's border guards, chalking maps upon the tarmac to help people on their journey, preparing lunchboxes for kids, and cleaning the common areas that were often rife with bed bugs. Occasionally, I'd pull out my copy of The Divine Comedy and read some passages aloud, and it resonated with those around me. Dante, after all, albeit 700 years ago, had been a refugee. Perhaps he could teach us something. His portrait of Odysseus certainly rang true after what I'd heard from Yusuf. A border-defying trickster Dante's Ulysses uses language cleverly to persuade, egging others on to trapassar del segno, to push beyond the limits or borders. Hot like fire, but I'm burning higher. Perhaps Yusuf was right. He was in a black odyssey of sorts. The lecture I'm going to give you today is unapologetically about stories, because I love stories and because stories are serious business for all of us who care about people. Stories structure how we make sense of ourselves and our place in the world, and they inspire us to make choices and to take risks. They shape how we receive and respond to others, both personally and as a society. As individuals embarking on a new path in the pursuit of safety and well-being, migrants depend on storytelling for their success, and in many cases, for their survival. So in this lecture, I'm going to explore how storytelling comes into play for migrants, as central to their experience of and navigation of borders. Throughout, I'll explore the relationship between storytelling and well-being. In the first part, I'm going to map out for you the link between storytelling and the nature of life. Life, that is, as narrative. We'll consider how narrative shapes our everyday experiences and prompts the important stuff of migration dreams. The important stuff of migration dreams, which may or may not lead to the enactment of an act of physical migration. In the second part of the lecture, I want to complicate what we think we know about the refugee story and how they are or ought to be told. By borrowing from literary theory, I hope to show that it's not just what they say, but how migrants are able to tell their stories that is absolutely crucial to their well-being. In the third and final part of the lecture, I'm going to propose a theory of ontological violence and resistance as a way of theorizing the relationship between migration storytelling and well-being as it appeared in my research. And I'll conclude with some reflections on the critical but diminishing role of sanctuary spaces where migrant stories can be told and entertained in all of their complexity, including, among others, our universities. I should add that it is so weird talking to an invisible screen, but something there along the intersubjective nature of stories, but we're just going to go with it. Bring back in-person lectures. In this lecture, I draw on 60 interviews with unaccompanied migrant and asylum seeker children and young people, which I conducted between 2015 and 17. I also draw on ethnographic data from time I spent working in refugee camps and asylum support centres with young people in Italy and England. Sparked by Yusuf's insights, coupled with the desire to try and really hear what young people were telling me, this lecture draws on some work I've done examining how certain narrative genres appeared in the stories that I was told. I want to acknowledge at the very start that these stories are not my stories, and yet in some ways, perhaps, they are my stories. Through dint of my having been the interlocutor when they were told, they are my stories. And perhaps they're stories in which I played a part. So these are not my stories, and yet perhaps they are my stories. And I'm going to leave that question quite provocatively open. I want to sincerely thank each and every person who's taken the time to talk to me or who has written about their experiences in a way that I've been able to draw on them today. So to kick off our discussion, there's a massive literature out there on the role of stories in our lives. And there appears to be a consensus around the idea that life, by its very nature, is inherently narratological. Peter Brook's seminal work on literary criticism, Reading for the Plot, starts with the assertion that our lives are ceaselessly intertwined with narrative. We tell stories and hear stories. We dream stories, or we imagine what it would be like to tell through stories. All of these stories are reworked in that story of our own lives that we narrate to ourselves in an episodic, sometimes semi-conscious, but virtually uninterrupted monologue. I direct you to the ethnographer Michael Jackson, not to be confused with the paedophile, and his brilliant study of the politics of storytelling for a more nuanced analysis of storytelling as praxis versus storytelling as a cognitive or speech act. But for the sake of this lecture, I want to make it much simpler and just simply distinguish between stories as they are enacted and stories as they are told. In both cases, as Jackson posits, in making and retelling stories, we remake reality in order to make it bearable. However, though related, these processes have different functions. The first function, story making, refers to the psychic act of plotting. Plots being, according to Peter Brooks, not simply organizing structures, but also intentional structures that are goal-orientated and forward-moving. Story making is equivalent here to planning, something that leads to the taking of action in the real world. Storytelling, meanwhile, may or may not involve action in the real world, but rather the sharing of stories with others, or even simply with oneself. In the first part of this lecture, I'm going to tackle the question of story making. Border crossing usually starts with a story in the form of an unrealized dream about a better life. But this dream can soon lead to action. In other words, migrations are usually plotted to some degree, although of course forced movements can lead to very last minute and chaotic flights. In my research, I found that migration was often the product, or at least the partial product, of a well-rehearsed dream. Indeed, at a conference in Brussels in 2010 on irregular migration from Africa to Europe, an African delegate explained, to the chagrin and, I'm sorry to say, mockery of some European border officials, that the reason her people were not responsive to the warnings and propaganda which they put out on the risks of irregular migration was because migration is about dreams. And I'm talking here about adverts put in newspapers or billboards kind of saying, do not come, you are not welcome in Europe, and all of these kind of things. Our colleague said, until we can find a way to get inside these young people's heads and reprogram their dreams, we will struggle to ever fully control migration. And dreams, she added with a note of caution, are the hardest thing to regulate of all. A policy expert, I should add, at the time tweeted, and I hope he's listening, it's guff like this that gets in the way of evidence-based policymaking. Among many other things, it's my hope that in this lecture, I will prove him so very wrong. Speaking about the Eritrean young people passing through the refugee camp in Rome in 2015, Rakim, an Eritrean elder who I befriended, made a similar statement to me about the power of dreams. They go to Europe even before they arrive, he explained, tapping his head. Mentally, they're already there. And you know what? Some will make it. They would make it, he hammered home. Just you wait and see. In my narrative typology, I identify this trope as a utopia, a story of a place of ideal perfection, especially in laws, government, and social conditions. In a pencil sketch, Ahmed, 16 from Egypt, depicted one day the difference between the idea he had of a life in Europe and the reality. He drew two people speaking on the phone with a boat traveling between them. I asked him to tell me about his picture. It's me and my cousin, he said. He's in Italy and I'm in Egypt and we're talking on the phone. I'm asking him, so how's Italy? And he says, oh yeah, it's great. There's work, there's money, there's all you could ever want. You have to come to Italy. Then, says Ahmed, he comes to Italy and well, it's not like that. Ahmed called his picture the illusion of Italy. Madi from Senegal explained the power of his own dream and how it prompted him to take huge risks in the following terms. Must go, must go, must go, must go. The dream's too much. Even if you talk about the sea, the water is boiling, they'll cross it. They would rather die. People are like this. These examples show in stark terms how narrative thinking informs and indeed compels migration. And Madi gives us a simple reason why. People, he says. People are like this. Ontology is a fancy term which describes the nature of our being or becoming, in so much as we are all people like this. Ontological security, coined by Anthony Giddens, describes our common experience of having a firm sense of self and an identity that we can project into the future. It means we're able to imagine our lives and what they might look like going forwards. Where we lack this sense of ontological security, we use stories as a way of coping. How many of us here have sometimes repeated the mantra, "This too shall pass"? We might have a dream that we simply entertain as a fantasy from time to time to help us sleep. And perhaps the less said by me on that, the better. Or we might harbour a dream on which one fine day, a combination of push and pull factors forces us to act. The crystallization of stories into dreams, then, is an imaginative act that can have very real-world consequences for migration movements. And as the African delegate we met earlier on in this lecture informed us, this stuff is very hard to regulate. Stories provide a source of crucial comfort to those whose lives are difficult to bear in countries facing war or economic hardship. And migration, with the promise of a better life and as one of the grand narratives of all time, is, of course, hugely appealing. The costs of pursuing this dream for many are, of course, incredibly high. In the last decade, over 24,000 migrants have drowned in the Mediterranean, and that's just the ones that we know about. 4 boys, Alex, Mulubran, Filman, and Gul, all unaccompanied Eritrean asylum seekers, took their lives in London in 2018 in the space of a year after being ground down by a system that was so unresponsive to their need for urgent care. But as Rakim, the Eritrean elder I cited earlier on in this lecture, was so insistent to point out, some do make it. Not all fantasies turn out to be disappointments. Several young people in my research achieved the aims of their migration projects, and these generally correlated with one or usually more than one of the following aims: to seek safety, to seek work, pursue education, or to reunite with and establish a family. Several have pursued their studies, made families, and secured fantastic jobs. And I should say that I've become a godmother a number of times in a number of different religions. They often report to me their successes in epic terms. They demonstrate pride in having overcome overwhelming odds. Sometimes they embellish events. One young friend told me that he punched a shark in the Mediterranean Sea on his way here. And perhaps it's true. Imagination is a powerful tool that complicates questions of truth and lies. And I'm someone of the school who believes that some fictions can be truer than truths. Dil from Afghanistan shared a very truthful fiction in the form of a joke to celebrate the achievements of his Afghan brothers overcoming the odds to come to Europe. It pokes fun at the whole idea of the supremacy of developed nations and the rule of law. And he'll probably be really mad at me if he's listening for telling it wrong, but it goes something like this. American astronaut Neil Armstrong is surprised. He's been working really hard, training on his moon mission, and when he arrives, he sees a group of Afghans huddled around a fire having a barbecue. They've put up their own tattered flag on display, so he's standing there with his own flag in hand, unsure of what to do. What the hell? Questions Armstrong, astounded that after billions of pounds in investment from the USA, these poor individuals have managed to get there first. How? Through hard work and resilience. What did you expect? Responds one of the Afghan moon refugees. Of course we got here first. We took the illegal route. The joke is at once comic, and it also celebrates the journey of refugees as a narrative epic that is a success. Here, the refugees are the victorious underdogs. Migrating to Europe for the young people in my study then, in summary, could be awful, but it could be fun too. The fact of finding adventure, even in the direst of circumstances, is one that's latent in many refugee narratives. It's ignored all the time. It's ignored, but it's important. It's important because it's true, and it's also deeply, deeply human. The idea that asylum seekers must always be suffering to be deserving is a cruel but pervasive one. I want to challenge this now as I turn to the second part of my lecture, and I'm going to do this by drawing attention to other ways young migrants in my research sought to subvert stereotypical stories and play with narrative in an effort to rewrite the scripts that the bureaucracies had given them. Many people have written about how researchers or social workers working with asylum seekers, we must be wary of restaging the experiences of bureaucratic interviews. As well as being re-traumatizing, it can prompt people to tell a certain type of story that they think we want to hear, stories that they're used to telling institutions as a way of getting what they need. This might be food stamps, clothes, or what Roger Zetter, our colleague in Oxford, calls the prize label of refugee itself. The late Barbara Harold Bond, the pioneer of refugee studies, in her seminal work, Imposing Age, showed how refugees are required to perform stereotypical tragic narratives and hide their agency as a way to access certain types of assistance. Because of asylum seekers' reliance on charity and state welfare, they can be held hostage to a particular logic of deservingness. As we've seen in part 1 of this lecture, there's often an open door between stories as told in the mind and stories as enacted in reality. There's some evidence in this sense that being forced to act out these vulnerability narratives might lead to what has been termed quite crudely in social policy literature, welfare dependency. More definitely, we should take seriously the claim that hostile environments for asylum seekers, which include, for the most part, no right to work, and living on, in the UK, £36 a week, causes low self-esteem, to say the least. At its core, the UK's self-proclaimed hostile environment seeks to undermine asylum seekers' sense of self by forcing them to confront life in undignified conditions, such as immigration detention, without any limit on time, and therefore without any hope for the future. This is a deliberate tactic. Faced with the vagaries of time and inhumanity, which are characteristic of the international border system, it's crucial then that asylum seekers have the chance to live and to tell other types of story, so as not to become trapped in the story of the vulnerable refugee. The case of Bilal is a case in point. His story is a tragedy, but it's not the kind of story you would read in the papers. He made quite clear in telling me his story that what I was hearing was something different to the account that he usually told to social workers or officials. Bilal was 22 at our first meeting. He'd arrived in England aged 16 after a year of traveling. He fled Afghanistan when he was 15, fearing forced recruitment into the Taliban. Once settled, he fell in love with the beautiful Karima, a fellow miner who was in the care system, and they dated for 3 years. Bilal's promising future was cut off when he turned 18 and, like many people in the UK, was refused asylum, detained and deported to Kabul. Bilal found in Afghanistan that he couldn't survive, so he left Afghanistan again. This time he headed to Dubai, returning only briefly to Afghanistan, from where he set off back to Europe, specifically to the old city which he called home. It was at this point in his story that I interviewed him. He had, he told me, cheated time, successfully returning through irregular means 2 years later to the place where he felt he belonged, even though the government has told him he wasn't welcome. His second journey to Europe included multiple deportations from Iran back to Afghanistan and grueling periods of forced labor in Turkey and Bulgaria, to pay his way. If Cal was the Black Ulysses, Bilal appeared to me to be the South Asian Sisyphus, bearing the weight of passing time in the face of an impossibly bounded border regime. I asked Bilal what his primary motivation was for remigrating, and his answer stood out from the fear and economic insecurity referenced by most young people that I spoke to. His reason, he said, blushing, was love. He said that the fantasy of being reunited with Karima made it possible for him to endure the hardships of multiple displacement and remigration. He could frame himself as the hero of his own love story and maintain a sense of purpose going forwards. Quite remarkably, Bilal maintained that over subsequent interviews, despite the tragic circumstances that he faced on his return, that he still felt the same way. Because he didn't return triumphant, but rather destitute. While he struggled abroad to stay afloat, motivated by the prospect of a reunion, Karima had also received documents and moved on. As in many tragedies, Bilal had been thwarted by time. Karima had a new boyfriend and she was pregnant with her second child. When Bilal cried, I recognized his tears as the tears of someone who was heartbroken. But his recognition that the story of being reunited with Karima had given his life a purpose in spite of the outcome says a lot about the importance of migration stories as a means in themselves of coping, as well as being a desired end. Last time I'd met him, he'd hooked up with someone else. So there's a nice end to that story too. The need to keep a dream alive, not just as a condition of migrating for many, but as a way of life, and specifically a way of enduring the hostile conditions of life as an asylum seeker, was epitomized to me in this final vignette that I want to share with you to conclude my argument. It's from an appeal at Birmingham Sheldon Asylum Tribunal, which is just a few miles over here. I spent 6 months there observing over 100 asylum appeals as part of a prior research project. Each week, hundreds of people who have had their initial asylum applications refused come here to face the Home Office before a judge. The young person in question here is called Zabir, and he's from Afghanistan. He'd been refused asylum and was appealing his case. He didn't have representation. In the extract that I'm going to read out now, he's trying to argue for his right to stay in the UK and study on the grounds that after 7 years, he's made a life here and embarked on a successful education. His argument in legal terms correlates to Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which grants us a right to private and family life. And more philosophically, it relates to an argument put forward by Joseph Cairns that the time and ties that we spend in a place give us a sense of social membership. And it's been argued that these time and ties develop even more strongly and quickly among young people who are in their formative years. So Zabir's here, the Home Office representative is here, the judge is on a raised platform between them, and I'm sat at the back. The Home Office representative points out that Zabir was staying in the UK on temporary grounds with a permit that only lasted until he turned 18. This is because, like many unaccompanied minors who are refused asylum, because they're children, they can't be deported, and so they're given this temporary, discretionary, time-limited right to remain. So the Home Office representative puts it to him. When you were doing these qualifications, you knew full well that your asylum claim was dismissed and you could be removed from the UK, didn't you? And we'll just ignore here the fact that even if he did know that, he had multiple rights still to appeal it, and the fact that most asylum appeals are successful in the UK. But what Zabir said in response was striking. He said, I just had to believe it. I had to believe it. Home Office. You might have believed it, but you certainly knew it wasn't the case. Zabir pauses, then replies, yes, but I had to believe it. I was just so into my education. This example was one of several that I observed that went along similar lines. The implication is that because there may have been a possibility that his asylum case would have been refused, the years Zabir spent studying between the ages of 15 and 22 were irrelevant to the man he is today. It reveals, in absolutely stark terms, the state's attempt to deny a young person's right to an experience of quite simply being. That is, everything to do with making stories, plotting, moving forwards with his life. I could spend some time here bringing in fancy theories about Agamben and bare life and the right to have rights, etc. But I don't think I need to, because this anecdote strikes me as just quite frankly and obviously inhuman. The Home Office is seeking to do something akin to condemning him to life in Dante's Inferno, a world where, according to Eric Auerbach in his 1953 book, Mimesis, the eternally condemned are forced to press their cases and aspire to the realization of their ambitions, even as they remain fixed in the place assigned to them. The eternally condemned are forced to press their cases and aspire to the realization of their ambitions, even as they remain fixed in the place assigned to them. This, in Dante's vision, is the worst kind of imaginable punishment. In our book, Youth Migration and the Politics of Wellbeing, my colleague Elaine Chase and I refer to periods of waiting and stasis faced by many unaccompanied young migrants as a form of imposed ontological insecurity. Today, I want to go further and posit that this kind of denial of lived experience and enforced stasis is a form of ontological violence. In continuing to at once dream and act upon his dreams to plot forwards, Zabir nevertheless can be seen as enacting a form of ontological resistance. Because as with every other young person I've introduced you to in today's lecture, Zabir states, in no unequivocal terms, that being able to dream of a future and seek a sense of ontological security through pursuing his education was something that he simply had to do. And I believe him. More than that, I'd like to think that the stories I've shared with you today prove it. Zabir's narrative impulse and action reminds us of the universal need of storytelling to allow us to feel that we actively participate in a world that for a moment seemed to discount, demean, and disempower us. To circle back then to Dante, bearing witness to people's stories in the Asylum Tribunal, I often record the empathy and sense of earthly historicity that the figure of Dante feels towards his fellow men and women in the 14th century text. He too sees them as stuck or having a sense of being stuck imposed upon them. But while he may have endured hellish hardships, Zabir's path is led astray not by the hand of man-made But while he may have endured hellish hardships, Zabir's path is led astray not by the hand of divine providence, but by man-made borders which can be challenged and contested. Through plotting for a future then, unlike Dante's characters, Zabir was able to meet his deeply human need to believe that we may at once discern and determine the meaning of our journey through life. Even in the direst of circumstances, he had a sense of future. And through plotting and believing, he was able to work towards it. Zabir's appeal was successful, and he's now at university. So it seems that for him, the straight path wasn't lost for him after all. He made the right decision to take a risk and keep going with his studies. To conclude then, stories are central to the pursuit of well-being for all of us, no less asylum seekers. In this lecture, as we've explored how processes of border management interacted with, and in many cases interrupted, the migration plans of young people, we've seen how they sought to write themselves back into the narrative when the straight path appeared all but lost, or at least withheld from them because they didn't have a certain immigration status at a given point in time. I've sought to make the case that the telling of and listening to stories is a crucial component of how we ought to approach migrant well-being. Storytelling as an analytical tool helps us to understand how dreams come to pass. With its inherently forward-looking thrust, we've also seen that narrative is a crucial tool in challenging, fighting, and surviving the violence wrought by unjust immigration systems, both real and ontological. Drawing on the Becoming Adult study, I've identified the power of storytelling to help young migrants identify strengths and capabilities moving forwards, and to move away from an isolated position of unaccompaniedness. As Michael Jackson notes, stories disclose not just who we are, but what we have in common with others, not just who we think we are, but what shared circumstances bear upon our lives and our fate. The question of shared circumstances here reminds us that storytelling is a community enterprise that relies on having someone to listen. And again, that's why I'm kind of struggling without seeing you guys in giving this lecture. But on this question of listening, I think universities can and should do far, far more. This is because studying is a crucial part of how we develop ourselves and enact new stories to shape our communities, to change ourselves, and cheesy as it sounds, to change the world. We have a role as institutions to hold some of these stories in their unfurling, and this includes opening the doors to more migrant, asylum seeker, and refugee staff and students, as well as funding more research in this area. With this in mind, we must nevertheless be forever wary of what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the single story. This, as Roger Zeta reminds us, is so often attached to a single bureaucratic label. Britain is forever telling us that we want the brightest and the best international students. And yet at the same time, we want the most vulnerable and deserving refugees. Why can't we have both? Why can't we have both in the same student? In welcoming migrant students, like any students, we need to welcome them as individuals who are at once whole and in a state of becoming. I want our students at the University of Birmingham and across all universities who are part of the EUniWell Sanctuary Network to know that you can be an asylum seeker and ambitious. You can be at once an economic migrant and a refugee. We need to unpack all of these labels and allow these stories to emerge in their complexity. So with this in mind, I want to take the opportunity in closing to draw attention to and to thank sincerely the new University of Birmingham University of Sanctuary Group, and to the refugee support network that exists across EUniWell universities, which is led by a dear colleague in Florence, Alberto Tonini. If you've been moved by what you've heard today and you'd like to get involved and perhaps help shape a young person's aspirations and their story, we would absolutely love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and for this fascinating journey into the stories and how they are located within the biographies of the people that you have worked with over time, and of course for doing all this, talking about Dante as well. That's so it's always a pleasure to hear you talking about Dante. We have at the moment 3 questions for you. The first one is more about what role can university have to support refugees, which part you addressed towards the end, but I don't know if you want to add anything else. And the second question is more around the spaces for hearing the stories of the refugees, the young migrants, Do you see a time where the real stories are told? How can we assure that the voices are heard? And finally, there's a question about what platform can we use to support refugee stories and voices to ensure they can stay in control of the narrative?
Thanks, Nando. I think that raises a whole load of interesting questions. On the first point about universities supporting migrants and refugees, I think one thing that we're realizing as part of this EUniWell work, and I should say to those of you who are joining us, EUniWell refers to several universities that are part of the European University for Wellbeing, and University of Birmingham's really proud to be a part of that. Brexit or no Brexit, we will write the narrative that says that we are part of Europe and we're happy to be part of the network. Says me, not officially on behalf of the university. But one of the things that we're discovering in this network is that each country seems to face its own challenges in making universities accessible for particular groups of migrants and refugees. Something that we're finding in the UK is that while once people are recorded refugee status, they're classed as home students, which means they pay less fees, and they're also eligible to get a student loan. Whereas for asylum seekers who can sometimes wait years to get a decision on their claim, and they're classed as international students. And during this time, as I've said, most of the time they're not allowed to work and they live on just £36 a day. So during this time, studying and working towards a university degree can be something that is just absolutely ideal and really perfect. So many young people in our study have been able to secure scholarships and succeed in this kind of way. There's an organisation called Article 26, which offers scholarships specifically for asylum seeker students. But sometimes universities are also scared to accept asylum seeker students, even where money is made available. And one of the reasons they give for this is because young people might drop out if they're refused asylum, and they might be deported and sent back to their country of origin. The reality of this is that it is a risk, but as I've said, most asylum appeals take a very long time to go through, and the majority are also successful in appeal. So there is some chance that young people might not be able to complete their studies, but there is also a very high chance that they might. And I think universities shouldn't be risk averse. And I think the benefits of having a diversity of students and having asylum seeker students who kind of come to the institutions with all of this incredible experience is something that far outweighs any kind of risk factor of possibly them having to interrupt their studies and that making kind of university retention rates look bad. I think we have to be really bold and brave on this, and certainly at the University of Birmingham we have a really active student action for refugees group, and there's no question that the diversity of our student body is like something that is a huge asset to everybody's university experience. Our colleagues in other European countries who I've been talking with are doing a lot better than we are in the UK. We have a University of Sanctuary network, which is fantastic. But I've been speaking to colleagues in Cologne and Leiden who, you know, have whole special support centres for students from a sanctuary background and specific modules that are catering to the needs of asylum seekers who might not be able to commit to a whole degree. So I think we should be really ambitious. I mean, especially here in Birmingham, we had the Nobel Prize winner Malala Yousafzai come to Birmingham and make it her home, and we were so proud to welcome her here as a sanctuary city. And we have a huge diversity of asylum seekers in our population who can make a great contribution to our university. So so I think that that's something that we all just need to keep working on, and I'm really hopeful that we can make some progress. I mean, pretty much most of the academics I think I've cited in my paper today, and this wasn't intentional, but they're refugees. The experience of exile often, and I hate to romanticize it, but can prompt, you know, extreme pivots in thinking and critical perspectives. And our colleague Lindsay Stonebridge, who is is in the Department of Arts and Humanities here at Birmingham, has done some really amazing work looking at writers in exile and thinkers in exile, and what they've been able to do. Chief among them, Hannah Arendt, who I think she's as obsessed with as I am Dante. In terms of spaces to hear stories, real stories as told as opposed to kind of other kinds of stories. I think there's an issue, isn't there, with doing any kind of research around refugee stories or migrant stories where, you know, as I problematized at the beginning of the lecture, whose stories are these? And there's that perpetual thing of when you have a right to ask someone to tell a story and what you can expect in terms of whether somebody might be likely to reply or trust you to tell you a story. So I think creating spaces to hear stories, it's really important that, as somebody said in their third question, that the people directly affected are in charge of the narrative and how it's told. That being said, I think there are some stories that just shouldn't be told, perhaps in certain settings. Some deeply private stories that we all have that we might not want to be told in certain settings. And I think as a researcher, you always have that push that you want to know some idea of truth. And one thing that I've learned in my research is the whole idea of truth and lies is just completely problematized when you enter into this world. You know, like I said about the young person who said that he'd punched a shark, or, you know, I had other young people who told me about the crocodiles in the Mediterranean. You know, these things tell us truths about experience, but, you know, they're very different to what we might think about in terms of a real story. You know, those stories are more real than if somebody says, I got in a boat and I crossed the Mediterranean, because they capture an emotional reality. And, you know, we come across this problem time and time again in the way asylum applications are rejected, because the people who are reading them and assessing these testimony take everything really literally at face value. And often, especially for people who've experienced trauma, their narratives might be fragmented or confused. And so you have this horrific situation where somebody might say, when the Taliban arrived in my house, I hid in the oven. And then maybe if they're asked to tell their story another time, they might say, when the Taliban arrived at my house, I hid under the table. And the government can use that discrepancy to argue that the young person is lying, or the migrant, whoever they may be, is lying, because they've told something that isn't true. But I think, you know, and a lot of research on trauma backs this up. The actual act of whether you hid under a table or in an oven is really not that important. What is important is the emotional reality of absolute fear for your life. So I think this question of how asylum adjudicators look at refugee stories is absolutely fundamental, and how they assess questions of truth and lies. We hold asylum seekers to this incredibly high standard, where they have to kind of prove themselves innocent, as if they're already assumed to be lying and to be guilty. And I think, you know, that's something that many people have written about, the fact we need to change. And, you know, there's a broader debate there about the fact that, well, if the criteria for what makes somebody a refugee and the criteria of what you need to include in your story to be recognized as a refugee is so narrow, that maybe we need to have far more expansive ideas of what constitutes a right to move. And that's why I've kind of quite deliberately in this lecture moved around terminology of migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. I think there's also an interesting point that comes up here around platforms for narratives. I'm curious about how many people who I'm talking to here have different social media accounts for different people, because I certainly tell different stories to different people in my life. And one of the things, I'll just tell you an anecdote to prove this, but one of the things that really came out in the research was the huge pressure that a lot of asylum seekers and migrants faced to project an idea that everything was fine to people back home so that they wouldn't worry. So sometimes you'd kind of see the young people in Rome like hanging around the volunteers' cars and taking pictures. I mean, really kind of pretty fancy pictures, kind of like across the bonnet, kind of looking kind of really suave, like, yeah, we've made it in Europe. And you know, they would upload these on Facebook or social media and kind of send those home to be like, look, I've made it, it's great. And you know, so there's this kind of pressure to, as we all experience, and you know, one thing I just want to hit home more than anything is this: we are all the same. You know, we're all people, and so much of what I'm saying applies to all of us. But that pressure to keep up appearances and project a kind of sense of everything being fine when it might not be. And one of the young people in the camp referred to Facebook as the word integrinia. I think I might get it wrong, but I think it was hakurka, which is like scratching or like scabies. And there was like this kind of in-joke where whenever they would start scratching scabies, they'd say, oh, it's like Facebook, it's like Facebook. Because there was this sense that every time you went on social media and you fed another story about how great your life was and how well you were doing, the momentum of this narrative kind of picked up on its own. And then it became really hard to kind of row back from that and say, actually, it's really hard. I'm in a camp, I've been refused asylum, I'm living on nothing, I'm not coping. And again, I think that's something that we can all relate to. And I really would defend our right to be able to constantly have shifting and multiple narratives. And that's something, as I've tried to explain in this lecture, that I think asylum seekers are really denied. You're not allowed to be into fashion and cars somehow and be an asylum seeker. You're not allowed to have a nice phone and be an asylum seeker. I have a really amazing colleague, Wally, sorry, well, his stage name or his artistic name is Ikari Jones. And he does fashion shoots with asylum seekers in camps in Italy. And he dresses them in these kind of incredible fabrics and clothes. And some of his work was featured in the movie Black Panther. And there's a podcast actually that I created during COVID called Immigration and Democracy. And I think it's the final one in the series. You can find it on Spotify or any of the other Apple, any of the podcast sections. But there's an interview with him and he talks about kind of how fashion can be used as kind of overcoming some of these stereotypical narratives and giving people the opportunity to explore other ways of presenting themselves. And finally, I'll just tell you one more anecdote, which again relates to this pressure of keeping up appearances and kind of trying to pursue your own life project and your own dreams, whilst also being cautious that you have an obligation and a pressure to support your family back home, or perhaps pay off debts for your journey, which is something that a lot of asylum seekers and refugees face. And as part of our research, we were really struck by how much we laughed a lot of the time. And we were working with a team of 10 young asylum seekers who were paid research assistants with us. We were just laughing all the time. So we decided to host some comedy workshops. And one of the sketches that the young people came up with, which was, I think, inspired by you, Nando, because your name is Nando, and they were absolutely obsessed with Nando's. And it was kind of like mind-blowing that this person could be called Nando and that there was Nando's. So the sketch was themed around chickens. And in this case, a chicken that somebody had got that laid golden eggs. And they were kind of on the phone to their parents, and the mum saying, so has the chicken laid a golden egg yet? And he's saying, yeah, you know, in Europe, it's amazing. All the chickens lay golden eggs. What the hell am I gonna do? There's no golden egg. And it was kind of this very comic way, but of saying something that was just so upsetting about these different parallel stories that people tell about their lives to different people.
We got a few more questions, but only a few minutes to answer. One is related to the collective or individual nature of the story that the young migrants tell. To what extent those stories are the product of a collectivity or they are of individuality? The second question is around not everyone has got the same storytelling skills. How can we help people young migrants or refugees or some seekers to develop this sort of capacity of telling stories if they need to? And the final one is a question around cultural appropriation. Who is allowed to tell the story of migration and migrants? And Justine is referring to a controversy in US around the publication of a book by Janine Cunning, American Dirt. So if you have a view on that. Only 4 minutes now.
Oh my God, it's such amazing questions. Okay, this is great. This is inspiring me to finish my book, to answer all your questions. Collective and individual stories. I think it's a real issue with human rights, isn't it? You know, the whole asylum system, the whole human rights system is based on this idea of one individual making a claim for themselves. We talk about unaccompanied minors all the time, when, you know, we know that a lot of these young people are embedded in networks and communities, and that their stories aren't just about an individual, they're about a kind of group and a community. And so many young people in our work are, you know, their plans and their hopes and dreams are so shaped by their obligations and responsibilities to other people around them. And it's just really, really inspiring. In some cases, I'm doing some work at the moment on Indigenous migration. And, you know, there are some cases where just the whole concept of it just doesn't relate or map onto people's experiences. My colleague and friend Rigoberta Menchú-Tum, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in Guatemala, she came under huge attacks when she published her memoir, because she was describing experiences that had happened to her Mayan community in the first person, I. And people kind of came back and said, but that didn't happen to you or your family. And it was kind of like, again, what is truth? What is what we experience? And in terms of stories and who owns them, I mean, I'll be quite frank, but I've suffered quite a lot myself from vicarious trauma, being really moved and feeling almost like as a secondary way, some of the pain and experiences of trauma that young people have shared with me. So again, this kind of porousness between self and other, I think, is something that's really tricky. Storytelling skills. I think there are some amazing projects happening that are really beneficial for everyone, where you find really great storytellers, artists, museum curators, designers coming together, you know, with people in the migration community who don't necessarily have those storytelling skills, to come together and kind of work together to tell those stories. Some great poetry books. Our colleague Elaine Chase, her husband Martin Pevsner, has written a really wonderful book with one of the young people in our study, Habib Rezai, about his experience, called The Doorman of Erdogan, I think it's called. And finally, American Dirt. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question. I do think, and it's controversial, and I wouldn't do it myself, but I personally take the stance that I would defend people's right to try and tell any story. I think it becomes problematic when you claim that it is your own story, or in the case of American Dirt, I think she got a manicure with like barbed wire on it as part of her launch event, which was pretty grotesque. But in terms of actually telling a story or writing a story, if it's a work of fiction, I think it's really crucial that we maintain the right to do that. My favorite depiction of a woman having a breakdown ever in literature, and you know, that's something I know a lot about, is Madame Bovary, and that was written by you know, Frenchman in the 19th century. So, you know, I think we can try and capture and portray emotional realities, even if it isn't our direct experience.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I think we need to close. It's a pleasure to listen to you. It's a pity not to be able to get the feedback from the faces of the participants, but from the comments, people seem to really have enjoyed, and there's been a discussion both in the chat and the questions. So thank you once again. We're going to post the lecture on EUniWell website and on IRIS website, so for people to be able to circulate it and listen again. Thank you very much.
Cheers, thanks.
Anna, I don't know if you want to say something, or can we close?
Yeah, just echoing a thank you to everyone for coming today and for participating, and so many excellent questions as well. And Nando, to you and Jennifer for taking part in our open lecture series. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.